And welcome back to the Private Cloud Jumpstart, creating and managing a Microsoft Private Cloud with System Center 2012. I'm Simon Perryman, Microsoft Technical Evangelist, and I'm joined again by Kenan Owens, Technical Marketing Manager.
Product Marketing Manager
with System Center 2012. Kenan's our infrastructure guy, and so we've already done a few sessions on managing the infrastructure. We really focused on the individual hardware pieces. With this module, we're now going to focus on thinking about how we can optimize those components for the hardware, for the private cloud. So why don't you go into a little more details of what we're going to cover in this module?
Okay, in this module today, we're going to cover the monitoring and operating on the private cloud infrastructure. So the previous session was all about those physical devices and how do I make sure that those things are running correctly. I've already talked about how to configure and deploy everything. Now, once I have those things available and I've created this private cloud and it's been running for a few days, weeks, months, years, I need to make sure that I'm giving the proper amount of resources to all the different applications.
Great.
So we're going to talk about how to optimize it, how you can control access to it, how you standardize updates to things like deployed services, and then how you make sure that you have the right size cloud.
That's great. Now, before we dive into this, there is one question that I've seen come up a few times, so I think it's worth us addressing now.
Okay.
When we're thinking about deploying and configuring an operating system, a VM, when should we use VMM versus when should we use Configuration Manager? What are the trade-offs? What's kind of the roles for each of those different components?
So within System Center, you have a lot of tools that can do kind of cross activities and do kind of some pieces of the same thing. What I would look at is if I am managing that underlying Hyper-V server, that Hyper-V host, I'm going to use VMM to do that host management. If I use VMM to do the installation, I use VMM to connect it to the different storage and those types of things for the bare metal install, connect to the storage and configuration. Use it for the update and patch management for my Hyper-V underlying physical servers. I would use Config Manager for the Config Manager component for managing the the other physical hosts that I may have. Maybe I have a physical SQL cluster, and I would use Config Manager for keeping that patched and up to date and those types of things. I would use Config Manager across all of my systems, whether it be Hyper-V or all my other systems that are out there, for doing things like desired configuration management, where I'm checking to see if certain things are installed or certain things are set up.
This might be like a group policy, security settings.
Something like that, or maybe it's an application version or something, whether it's in compliance or not. And I would use Configuration Manager because with Configuration Manager 2012, we have the ability to not only get that information, but we can also set certain things. So I can force machines to upgrade to the proper version of something like that. So that's when I would use Config Manager. The other thing is, inside a virtual machine, with the virtual machines up and running, for everyday patch management, I would probably use Config Manager for managing and updating those patches. If I'm going to do service updates, maybe updates to the application that's installed inside of that service, then I would use VMM to push that service down. If I can use the service template format for updating things, I would use it as much as possible. Use Configuration Manager for the tasks that it normally would use, as well as for managing all my client and maybe my VDI VMs and those types of things.
Excellent, thanks.
Great. So if we move into, these things are up and running, the things that we're really going to focus on today is the now monitoring and operating that private cloud infrastructure itself. It's not the physical devices, but it's the cloud and ensuring that we have the proper access to the resources. So I'm going to flip by these slides really quick. You've probably seen them 3 or 4 times already, if not more. And the things that we're really going to focus on today is once we have this logical and standardized infrastructure, how do I make sure those clouds are running well? How do I make sure the applications running inside the clouds are getting the resources that they need? How do I ensure that the people that are accessing the resources are only accessing the ones that I want to give them permission to? And how do I keep these services updated and ready to go? So I'll do that in a few ways. One of them I have to do is ensure that I've optimized my underlying hypervisor resources and they're running the proper VMs, because we all know that load changes throughout the day, different times of the year, and I want to ensure that the virtual machines are getting the access to the resources that they need. I need to control who has access to these resources and how they consume those resources. And I want to be able to change these things on the fly if I need to. I have these service templates that I've created. We talked about in the configure and deploy module. Well, I need to standardize an approach to updating these services so that I can create this update once and deploy it out to many different deployed services. And then these cloud environments that I have, I want to ensure that they're sized appropriately now and that I'll be able to know before I have to grow, that I grow those systems. In other words, I don't want to run out of resources and then have to scramble to buy those servers. Instead, I'd rather grow it on time. Had a customer that they started implementing virtualization, they're moving to a private cloud, and so many people just started creating VMs over and over and over again on these systems that they overloaded the system before they really even knew that it was overloaded. And they needed to now scramble to buy more servers and get them up and running. If they were able to monitor those systems better, they could more easily know that, hey, we're starting to run out of resources. Let's proactively buy new hardware and get that thing up and running more efficiently. The other thing is, as I'm training things over time, I want to make sure that I can get these systems and keep them up and running appropriately as loads change. So one of the ways we handle changing in load is through dynamic optimization. And this is a new capability inside of Virtual Machine Manager, both dynamic optimization and power optimization. And why would I use dynamic optimization? What are the key benefits of it? Well, as application workloads in my environment change, I need my private cloud resources to automatically adjust to these changes in needs. In other words, I may have 30 different VMs or 150 or 300 VMs running on one cluster. And inside that cluster, during the periods of the day, certain of those VMs have a lot of resources needs, other VMs don't have any resources needs. But that changes constantly throughout the day, throughout the week, or maybe at the end of each quarter, I need these applications to get access to more resources. I need to rebalance those workloads on the fly, and that's what we can do with dynamic optimization. So what does it actually mean? What does it look like? Well, Virtual Machine Manager is monitoring the clusters within a host group. And inside that host group, they're looking at this individual cluster and they're looking at the resources. And as those resources go above a certain threshold, in other words, I've used so many resources on one of those hosts that I've basically not left enough resources that I'm comfortable with available on that system, then what I'll do is Virtual Machine Manager will see the different devices on that host and will automatically move the virtual machines away onto other systems within that host. So really what we're doing is we're looking at all the different virtual machines on all the different hosts, and we're taking basically a weighted 10-minute average across those systems. And as we find that we've moved across these different hosts thresholds, we will migrate virtual machines around at the optimization interval. And at that point, we've freed up the resources and everything's running fine until maybe a few minutes later, a few hours later, one of these other systems now goes above that specific threshold. At that point, we identify what's the best machine to move. We move that around, and by moving these things around between other systems, what we've done is kept all the machines below the optimization threshold. There are a couple of ways we do that. When we determine which virtual machines to move and how we move them, we use this technique called intelligent placement, which I'll go into a little bit, especially in the demo. And we only will move things if they have an advantage for the entire system. So if we look at the fundamentals of dynamic optimization, we want to keep the cluster balanced. So we want to be able to not have a very disparate amount of resources used by one host and not the other. So we don't want one running at 80% utilization, the other one running at 10% utilization. But instead, we want to keep it balanced between the systems. We want to avoid VM downtime. So we want to ensure that by having more resources available on each of these systems and balancing these systems out, the VMs will be more responsive to the applications running on them. And we do this dynamic optimization for not only Microsoft Hyper-V systems, but we can also do it for VMware vSphere or Citrix Xen Server clusters. So it's important to keep in mind that we're going to move things around depending on the resource utilization of those systems with that 10-minute average. So we consider things like the CPU utilization, we consider the memory utilization, and both disk and network I/O. And if any of those are surpassing thresholds, we're going to look to see where we can move those systems. So we'll move it when we go across a specific threshold, and we'll consider that entire cluster. We're not going to move a VM off of a system if it's just going to put another system over the threshold. You know, we're going to optimize this thing as best we can. And we do it with these different types of aggressiveness. So we have the ability to turn on whether you want to do this manually or you want to have it automated to rebalance this workload. You can choose the frequency with which you do this automation. By default, it's 10 minutes, but you could say, I only want to do load balancing every 30 minutes. I can drop it down to 5 minutes or 1 minute if I wanted to. And I have the ability to configure how aggressive this optimization is going to be. So what that really means is that when I'm going to move systems around, if I gain an advantage, if I look at intelligent placement, we have these things called star ratings. If I gain an advantage on the star ratings, where if I move it from one system to another, and it's going to free up either a 1-star rating or 0.5 star ratings, or actually it's 0.2, 4, 6, and 1-star rating, we're going to make that move, depending on how aggressive you're set.
Well, we actually have a few questions around the topic.
Sure.
So first one I'll quickly address. Is this similar to VMware's DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler technology?
It is similar to DRS, but it's a little different. We're taking into account, I think, more resources than traditionally DRS was taken into account. I don't know if it's using all these resources as well.
Now, these optimization thresholds that you mentioned, are these dynamically set? Can they be user configured? Are there choices?
They are. There's a default setting, and then they're user configured, and we'll go into that in the demo, and I'll show you where we set that.
Okay, great. Now, we had a feature in the current versions of VMM 2008 How2, Operations Manager 2007, called Performance and Resource Optimization, Pro Tips. It has similar functionality. Could you kind of compare and contrast the two and let us know what's happening with Pro in this current version of System Center?
Sure. So Pro was designed because VMM didn't take into account dynamic optimization. There are many aspects to Pro. Some of them have to do with looking at your Hyper-V machine and the VMs that are running on there. Other ones are actually looking at other devices. Maybe it's looking at your storage, or it's looking at the physical hardware itself. With dynamic optimization, what you're really going to do is replace all the Pro tips that basically we provided that look at the Hyper-V server and look at the VMs that are running. Those are just going to be done through dynamic optimization. The other Pro tips are still important, and they are very much still valid. We're working with those hardware vendors that we have those existing Pro tips with and those third-party partners to create an update to the Pro tips for System Center 2012. So right now, you wouldn't use the existing Pro tips against VMM 2012. But we're working to get those Pro tips updated for System Center 2012. So what I would say is that you wouldn't install the Pro tips like for Hyper-V management or the Pro tip for VM monitoring. Instead, use dynamic optimization.
Okay, great. Now, dynamic optimization, when it goes and actually moves a VM, can it either use a live migration or save state? What are the choices there?
So for dynamic optimization, it uses live migration to move those virtual machines across. That's why the atomic unit is a cluster. So you can have multiple clusters in the same host group, but for each cluster, we're going to move VMs within nodes within that cluster. Just like with VMware's DRS, it only moves within that HA-DRS cluster within the VMs automatically, even though you could live migrate something outside of it. We chose cluster as the atomic unit because all virtual machine vendors we support live migration within a cluster.
And so I've had a few questions on this as well. If I have a VMware cluster, I have a Windows Server cluster. Can I live migrate a VM between these two different clusters?
No, I can't. I can't live migrate it between it anyway, but dynamic optimization is only going to do things within a cluster. It's not going to take it from a VMware cluster and move it to a Xen server cluster or anything like that. The other thing is, if I have two Hyper-V clusters, I'm not going to migrate a VM, live migrate a VM from one Hyper-V cluster to the other one via dynamic optimization.
The boundary, again, is one cluster.
Exactly. Now, there are talks with new things that are coming in with the next version of Windows Server and things that it can do. So those things, if we exchange how things work, will be at that point in time.
Now, if a customer already has VMware's DRS configured, how does this work with that? How does it interact with that?
So if you have DRS already configured, you have a couple of options. You can continue for the VMware clusters to use DRS. You can use dynamic optimization for the Hyper-V or the Zen clusters that you have. You can enable dynamic optimization to manage your VMware and your Hyper-V and your Zen server clusters. What I wouldn't do is I wouldn't have dynamic optimization and DRS running against the same VMware cluster, because a couple things are going to happen. One, VMware is going to kick off a migration to move something around. Then dynamic optimization might say, hey, no, this flip the switch here. Now I got to move something around again. You're going to get lost in where things happen. So you would want to have, with VMware, managing VMware, one or the other. We're hoping that you would use dynamic optimization, but it's your choice for your organization.
Now, what about using Zen Server? Can we use dynamic optimization there?
Absolutely. So Zen Server has a cluster, and you can move virtual machines around, Zen Motion virtual machines between different systems, and dynamic optimization can work for those as well.
Now, what happens if we've identified this host that's reaching its resource limit? We need to move it, but there are no better hosts, meaning that all the other hosts in the cluster are even higher resource utilization. What happens then?
So at that point, we look at all the hosts, and when we consider optimizing it, depending on the aggressiveness, if we can gain better star ratings across all the hosts, we're going to do that. But if I move it from one system to another and it's not going to gain me any advantage, and in your example it wouldn't because all the other hosts are worse off than this host, we're not going to move things around at that point. So we're going to make sure that we don't hurt the cluster when we move things around, and we only do it if we make things better. And in that case, let's just flip over to the demo and let me show you a couple of things on it, because it might make things a little more understandable. So in this environment that we saw in the previous sessions, I have a couple of host groups here, and this administrative infrastructure host group has two clusters. It has an ESX cluster and it has a Hyper-V cluster. Inside of the host group is where I set the information for dynamic optimization. So there are a couple things that I want to look at here. First of all is I set host reserves. Now this is where I want to specify how much of the host resource is available before I decide whether or not I can place virtual machines on this host. So if I wanted to create a brand new VM and place it on this host, but by doing so will drop the utilization down to less than 10% available for the host, then I'm not going to do it, that type of thing. But those are the different values that I can look at when I'm considering dynamic optimization. The next step is, and this is the units, so I can look at things like either percentage, or I can look at either number of gigabytes or megabytes and or the percentage of RAM used on that host. I can check things like IOPS for disk I/O, gigabytes for disk space, as well as megabytes per second. So I can either look at percentage of utilization, or I can look at a strict value like how many megabytes per second. Then when I flip to the dynamic optimization tab, this is where I see the specifications that I can make. First of all, I can say how aggressive do I want this thing to be. Do I want it to be high aggressiveness, which means that I'll migrate things around if I get a 0.2 star benefit. And I'll migrate it even if I'm below the specific thresholds. So if I have it under high aggressiveness and I have one machine running at 70%, another machine running at 30%, I'm going to migrate VMs around even though I haven't passed a specific threshold, because I want to get them as close to even as possible. If I'm at medium high or medium, I'll also do that. And the numbers are 0.2 star threshold gain, 0.4, 0.6. If I'm at medium low or low, I will only migrate virtual machines if I am above a specific threshold. Then the next thing I do is I specify whether I want it to be manual or automated. In this example here, I have it manual, but I could easily just click this switch and it would turn on to be automated. And how often does it do it? It does it by that frequency level there. So this allows me to specify the configuration settings around dynamic optimization. But one other thing I can do is I can specify thresholds. So by default, we say as long as moving the virtual machines off of the system, we don't fall below that 30% available, we're going to keep the VMs on the system. If we fall below that 30% available, we'll move virtual machines off. And one of the examples here, I'm going to show you about dynamic optimization. What I've done is I've kicked up the RAM and I said, if I have so many virtual machines on this system that I don't have 27 gigs of RAM free on this system, then I want to kick off a dynamic optimization event. Now that's an extreme example because I would probably want that down at like 1 gig available or something like that. But what I've done there is I've set that threshold at a value so that when I have even a small set of VMs, I can go above whatever that value is and kick off a dynamic optimization event. So I specify these values, and then the next thing is I can do, if I have this thing set to automatic, is I can talk about power optimization, which we'll go into in a few minutes here. So I have these values set, and if we look at this environment, I have a bunch of different virtual machines running on this environment. Inside of my ESX cluster, I have 3 virtual machines. 2 of them are running on ESX Server 2, one of them is running on ESX Server 1. Well, I want to optimize this environment, and by just right-clicking, if I had this set on automatic, it would move virtual machines around for me. But since I have dynamic optimization set to manual, I'm just going to right-click on this server, and one of the options I have is the ability to optimize hosts. It's going to look at all the different virtual machines that are on there and say, hey, I have a VM on host 2, and dynamic optimization would help me move that, would tell me, hey, I want to move that to host 1. So it would just say, okay, these are all the different VMs that you have. This is where I think you should move these virtual machines. And then at this point, I can say, okay, great. I can either view scripts so I can know what the optimization is going to be, or the best thing to do here is just hit optimize. And at that point, it's actually going to kick off a live migration or a vMotion to move the server from VMware from host 2 over to host 1. And it's going to do that using vMotion. So that's one of the things that we talk about when we're doing live migration. Now, I remember that there were a couple of questions while this thing's running that you had about managing multiple hypervisor vendors. So
yes, we do. So, we talked about Xen management a little earlier already, but we just want to get confirmation. Do you need Xen Center? Do you need any other type of Xen management functionality to be able to do a Xen motion, to be able to manage those Xen VMs? And what's the difference with VMware where we do require vCenter?
So vCenter is required because when I do things like kick off live migration or vMotion inside of VMware, I can only do that through vCenter. With Citrix Xen Server, I can do that with just the Xen servers themselves. I don't need Xen Server to kick off something like Xen Motion. So you don't need any other tool besides Xen Server and VMM. So what will happen is within your Xen Server environment, you'll install a special integration pack from Citrix, and that custom pack will make it manageable by VMM. I would do that, and then I would be able to manage the virtual machines running on that system, but I wouldn't manage the underlying hardware. To manage the underlying hardware, I would have to go to my Citrix Xen Server and manage the hardware there if I wanted to add storage or something like that. I would do that at the Xen Server itself, not at VMM. And so VMM will manage the underlying hardware for for Hyper-V, but for VMware and for Citrix, I would do that hardware piece of it through Xen Center.
So how does this relate to the patch management that we discussed earlier? Now, with the patch management, with the cluster we're updating, we said that we patch the Hyper-V hosts. What happens in the case of VMware or Citrix?
So in Hyper-V, we can manage the underlying host and do patch updates. For updates to the VMware host or to the Citrix host, we would do that via their their hardware management tools. So I would, for updating ESX server hosts, I would use update management from vCenter. For updating Zen server, I would install the patches directly on Zen server. So we manage the underlying Microsoft Hyper-V environment, but we don't do the physical servers for ESX or Zen server.
Great. Now, another question about interoperability. Now, we touched on this in the scope of VMware, where we said we cannot live migrate a VM from, Windows Server over to VMware.
Right.
What about other types of migration? If we need to go and move all of my VMs from Zen, all of my VMs from VMware over to the Hyper-V platform, what is that process of converting them and moving them over?
So there are a couple options you have there if you want to migrate from one hypervisor to another. Probably the easiest one is if the machine's up and running, you would do basically a P2V of that virtual machine. So you have, just like you would have a physical machine running out there, you connect to it and you do a physical to virtual migration. If you're using a VMware environment, you could also do a virtual to virtual migration where I can shut down that virtual machine and I can import that virtual machine from the ESX server over to the Hyper-V systems. And I can do all that through VMM itself.
Great.
And that would be for your Windows guest operating systems.
That's all the questions I have for now.
Excellent. So the dynamic optimization allows me to move virtual machines around as the load changes throughout the day. Besides that, I want to talk now more about the power optimization, where dynamic optimization happens during a threshold that we go above. We start using more and more resources, so we want to move things around. Power optimization happens when I go below a threshold. In other words, I'm not using these resources. I have so many resources available. I want to shut some of those systems down. So if we look at power optimization, what it's really doing is this. It's looking at the systems, and as I drop below a specific optimization threshold where even if I shut down machines, I'll still have this many resources available, then at that point in time, we'll migrate all the VMs off of that particular machine. And after we migrate those virtual machines off of that machine, we will power down that physical box. So what this does is allows me to save some energy and just use the amount of resources that I need within the system. Now, over the time, I won't need those resources, but then the resource utilization will pick up and I'll start moving above that optimization threshold. At that point in time, we'll power on some or all of the remaining machines that we powered off. And then through dynamic optimization, it'll move virtual machines around to rebalance that workload. So this gives me the ability, when I don't need those resources, to shut them down, but when I do need them, we'll start them right back up again. And this uses the out-of-band management to do that, so I need to be able to connect to that HP ILO, Dell Drag, whatever that system is for that out-of-band management capabilities. So a couple things here. Again, we consider the same resources that we consider with dynamic optimization, but now we're basically going to do this event when we move below threshold. And we consider this the entire cluster, meaning that if I have some machines that are running under the threshold, but I can't, when I move everything off, still have all the machines that are left still be below that threshold, we're not going to move it around. So we're not going to shut a machine down just to 2 minutes later power it back up. You can specify what hours of the day, you can schedule when this is going to occur and when it's not. And it only is available when you set dynamic optimization to automated. A couple things to ensure here is that we won't power machines down if we're going to overload the remaining nodes in the cluster, and we're going to make sure that we don't violate any cluster quorum requirements that cluster may already have when you do this power optimization. So what that means is that you have to have enough nodes in that cluster that when we power some of them down, we'll still have the availability, so we'll still have the ability to fail over machines, but also we'll be able to, we'll still have that cluster be a valid cluster. So let's take a look at how we set those things and where that is. And if we go into the demo here, again, we see the host group that we have. And in that same host group, if we look at the properties, in that exact same place where we set dynamic optimization, we have to first turn on automatic, and by turning on automatic, we have the ability to enable power optimization. So if we enable power optimization, we get a whole new dialog that really goes into those settings. And before, where I had the settings set at specific values, it increases things like, okay, so I won't do this unless the host still has, after we've evacuated and powered off systems, still has 40% of CPU available. And I can adjust how that happens. And then I can also do things, well, I know that my systems are always busy between 6 and 8 in the morning on the weekdays, so I can turn those systems so that power optimization doesn't happen then when everybody's logging in the morning, and then when everybody comes back after lunch, I may want those systems available as well, so I don't have people, get slow email response times after lunch or something like that. But besides that, the rest of the day and the weekends, power optimization is fine. Just do it if it needs to. So I can specify just specific times that I want to do power optimization. Once I do this, again, it's going to look at the entire cluster. It's not going to shut down machines if it won't have enough available resources left to handle a failover. So inside of my systems, one of the things that I want to set as far as a rule is that in the cluster, I don't violate any cluster quorum capabilities as far as how many machines are going to be up and running. Once I do that, it'll do power optimization for my Hyper-V hosts only. All right, so that's power optimization and dynamic optimization. The next thing we want to talk about here is access to these resources. Now, within the configure and deploy private cloud infrastructure, we talked about different user roles and how they are important for delegating access to these clouds. Well, that's something that we're repeating in that section in this session here, because when you're talking about ongoing maintenance of your cloud, one of the things that's really important is who has access to what resources and what they need to do, or what they are allowed to do on those resources. And one of the things that's important to note is that when I set these different user roles, I have the ability to change all these values as needs of my organization change. So I want to ensure that the application owners have access to the resources that they need, but I don't want them to have full access to all my different resources, especially if I'm sharing these resources between different groups. And then lastly, I want to control what actions and what different devices or virtual machines these people can deploy to. So again, I do that by creating from the cloud, creating this delegated capacity model. And I use Active Directory for adding the different resources, the different users inside of there. I have the administrator accounts, and that would be either a full administrator or a delegated administrator to a different group. But I also have these things called user roles. And this self-service user is only specified at a cloud and has actions that I can grant, or I can pull away. Things to note here is that I can create these custom roles for different users and groups and give them different access. So I may have, say, a cloud users for a specific set of cloud resources, and they may only have things like start, stop, and deploy from a specific template. I may also create cloud admin roles, which has full access to the cloud. They can create new VMs, they can do all the different tasks that I would expect them to be able to perform. And they can then, by having them have this full cloud access, they can create different cloud users underneath them, so they can manage that stuff. So I can give access to one guy, and then he can divvy up and manage his cloud off of there. Use Active Directory and groups to manage these things. We talked a lot about quota in that configure and deploy session. The biggest thing here is I had one organization where they had a bunch of developers, and every developer had to deploy 5 different virtual machines for their application to work. They didn't want that developer to deploy multiple instances of their application and take up all the resources. So what they did was they had this group of developers, and they basically gave each of the developers the ability at the member level quota section to deploy only 5 virtual machines. So they were able to deploy one instance of their application. And they also said, well, I don't want each of these developers to have their own instance that's just sitting there running, doing nothing. So even though there were 20 developers in the group, they specified the number of virtual machines that that whole user role could create at 20. So that meant only 4 developers at a time could deploy their application and service on this cloud resources. And it helped them protect the rest of these resources from these developers that were just deploying many, many, many different virtual machines. All right, so we've talked now about dynamically optimizing cloud resources, rebalancing the load as the needs change. But then the next thing is we want to have these applications that are deployed, and we need to ensure that those applications are running at the appropriate version level. We want to make sure that if we have updates to the applications, not necessarily to the OS, but to the applications themselves, we're running these applications at the right version. We want an easy way to push these updates out so that we don't have to go to every single machine that we've deployed out and do these updates. Also, we may have different, what would you call it, updates to the OS itself, not small patch updates, but maybe a major update from, say, the OS to a service pack or the OS to an R2 or something like that. And we want to just do a wholesale replacement of that underlying OS. We can do those things through Virtual Machine Manager and standardizing those approaches to application updates. So if we look at the service model, service is something we showed you during the config and deploy on how to create a VM template and create a service template. But it's made up of multiple tiers, and each of those tiers could have one or more instances deployed on it. I have these deployed services based off of a template. And now what I can do is I can take that template, I can update the application or pieces of that template, and then I can push those updates out. So by taking this, using this service template model, I have the service template there, I make an update to that service template, I push that update over to the service that is deployed, and that service will then update that application, whatever layer it was inside that template, and get that application and that service updated to the whatever version it needs to be. And we can use and update either things like the configuration of the VMs, the applications installed on them, or even, like I said, the VHD file itself. So just a quick recap on what is a service template. Service template is this it could be one or more tiers of applications. Each of those tiers would have a VM template associated with it, and then I can deploy, and that VM template is made up of things like the hard drive of the VM, the OS settings, the applications installed on top of it, whether it's a web tier, so it may have MS Deploy package, an app tier with a server app V package, or a data tier with SQL DAC packages. And put all those stuff together into a VM tier, put those things together into a service template, which is stored in the library, and that template information we can then use as what we would call the source of truth for a service deployment. So what we have is these services that we deploy are template driven, and by having this one template as being the source of truth, what we're really gaining is the fact that when we want to update this service, we can update the template and push it down to these multiple instances of this deployed service. Within a particular tier, I may have multiple VMs installed or deployed, and what we can do within the tiers is that we can leverage upgrade domains so that we don't bring the entire tier down just to do an upgrade of that piece of the system. And we can do these updates either in place or image based. An in-place update is something that I would use if I was changing a particular setting inside the virtual machine. Maybe I wanted to go from a small amount of RAM to more RAM, or from a small number of processors to more processors, or I wanted to change a setting around the hardware, maybe add a new network adapter or something like that. The other reason I would use in-place settings is if I wanted to change an application. Maybe I had a server app package of version 1 and I wanted to update it to server app package version 2. Well, I would use in-place updates to basically just save the state of that application, pull out the version 1 of the application, drop down the version 2 of the application, and then apply the state to that application. And I can do all that stuff without having to really do a large-scale change of that virtual machine. If I want to do an image-based update, if I'm going from, say, Windows Server 2008 to Server 2008 R2, or from 2008 R2 to SP1, it may be faster for me to just drop in a brand new VHD file instead of having to run through the entire service pack update process. So we can, instead of replacing just a piece of the system with like the application, what we'll do is we'll lift up the application, replace in the OS itself, drop in a brand new VHD file, give it the same name, ID, and all that stuff that the old one had, and then drop that application back on top of it. So we'll reinstall and restore the state of that application. So, is there a question?
Yeah, there is one question. As we're looking at all of these service templates, the application maintenance, can this only work with Hyper-V, or can you use this template and service model on VMware or Citrix hosts as well?
This template and service model can be used on VMware or Citrix as well. This is all stuff done on top of to the VM itself, not necessarily to the hypervisor. So we can do this all for any of the different hypervisors. The other thing is that we can have services that span multiple hypervisors. So one tier could be on VMware, where another tier could be on Hyper-V, and we can do updates to that as easily as anything else.
Now, do we have limitations about what can actually run inside the VM that's in the service template? For example, if you wanted to use some other type of database instead of a SQL database, or if you wanted to use a Linux operating system instead of a Windows Server operating system. Again,
so
in the VM guest.
So within the VM guest, you can have, for each of the tiers, it could be whatever is a supported guest operating system. So it could be a Linux guest operating system. The thing is, to do the customization stuff that we would do, that stuff and the updates would only be done against a Windows operating system. If I have, say, an Oracle database instead of a SQL database, I wouldn't use the SQL DAC packs and the updates that we do via the service template. But if it's running Oracle on Windows, then I can create a custom script that performs those update actions and does the things that I wanted to do, but it would have to be something that I would have to script and create myself. If that was maybe installed as a server app package or something like that, that might give me a way around some of these things. The things I need to be careful are is that I need to understand how that upgrade for that application works and be able to script that appropriately. But then I can, once I do that, I can push it out anywhere I need to.
Excellent.
All right, so in this example here, I have this template library, and inside this template library, I have a service template that I want to deploy. So I pick that template out of this template library, and I deploy that service. So it's going to deploy an instance of that service, and that service in this example has 3 tiers. It has a web tier with 3 virtual machines, has an app tier with 3 virtual machines, and then it has a database tier with only 1 virtual machine running SQL. And I have versioned this data, and I call it version 1.0. Well, I have an update, and maybe that update is just I want to change the amount of RAM on the application server, or I want to update the application itself from a version 1 to a version 1.5 or something like that. Well, I make a copy of the service template, and then in that service template, I give it the new version number. I go through and make all the changes to that template that I need to make to the service template, change the amount of RAM or whatever it is I'm changing, update the application. And then after I've done all that, I save the template. The next step is to publish that template. And when I publish the template, if I refresh the VM or I look at the VM, it says, hey, there's a new update available for this virtual machine. So the virtual machine service, the service will be in this pending service update state. It doesn't say that, it's not going to apply the update for me automatically. It's just going to tell me, hey, there's an update available. At that point in time, I can push that update down to the service. And because of the use of upgrade domains, we're not going to bring down the entire tier just to upgrade this application tier, but instead we're going to bring it down one at a time and do the updates. So I push the update down, and what we'll see is that I'll update the applications within that tier, but I'll do it one at a time and not the entire piece itself. Set the version release number of the service to 1.5, and now I can go and do this update to all the different deployed services that I have. If I look at image-based updates, it's very similar to how it's configured. And in image-based updates, what we're really doing is, instead of replacing the configuration of the VM or the application installed on it, we're updating the actual VHD file itself. So I have a deployed service that's out there, again, version 1.0. If I'm going to do image-based updates, then the first thing I'm going to do is make a copy of that template, reversion it to, let's say, 1.5, and then I'm going to update the VHD file for one of those service templates. Maybe I'll go from Windows Server 2008 R2 to Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1. Then what happens is that I'll again publish that template. It'll make it look like, hey, there's an update available. This template service will be set at pending service update. Then the next step here is I will push down that update to the tiers, to that service. Again, it's going to take into account upgrade domain, so it's not going to bring down the entire version unless I wanted to. And the other thing is that it's going to take the application that's installed on that machine, it's going to basically lift it up, it's going to deploy a brand new VHD, do the install process, sysprep it, give it the same name, unique information that the old VM had, and then it's going to drop back the application onto that machine and restore all the state of that application onto that machine. So this is something that's going to take a lot longer per VM because it has to do basically a full install of the VHD file, copy that to the machine, and then deploy it and get that up and running. So image-based updates are something that we're probably not going to use a lot of, but you would only use it for large-scale updates, or if you wanted to do a whole-scale change of the application that was deployed or something like that. So what I like to do is go through and talk about these things and show you what that piece looks like. So I'm going to switch over to the demo here.
Now, we had a question that came in. So under this broad umbrella category of all of these different types of service template updates we have, is there any way that we actually document what's being changed? Basically, is there any way that we just keep track of, hey, we applied this template, this got changed, just for compliance reasons?
So within the different templates, we keep all the different templates that we have deployed, so you can check the difference between them. We do store things in the jobs, information about what was done and what things have been changed, so you can pull some of that information out. The other way to do it is, use this configuration manager and desired configuration management to pull that information out of the machine. You can do that and keep track before and after of what types of things have been changed.
So as a slightly broader question then that's related, is there any type of logging that happens, if you need to go back and see what's happened with VMM, is there any type of logging that you can go back and trace, hey, VMM did this at this time, it did this at this time?
Absolutely. So that's all stored in the jobs that we have. So we have all these different jobs, and if, let's say, a job failed, it tells you, what failed and why that thing might fail. But let me drop this thing down. We see all these different jobs that have been set within the environment, so you can actually look inside of there and see what's been happening with that service or what's been happening with that application.
Right.
So you can look back there. We also store a lot of information in the event logs, and we post information there, so you can, if something fails, you can look in the event log and see what's been happening at that point. If we look at the library and we look under service templates, it can see that I already have, in this customer demographics server, I have multiple different versions, version 1.2, 1.3, 1.5. And these are updates that I've created over time. If we look at the actual deployed service that I have, go into the VMs and services, click under services here. Under the customer demographics service that's running, we see that we're running version 1.2. So we're running template version 1.2, and that's the one that's available for it. I've done some upgrades before in the past and dropped them back off. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you how we go through and make the update and make the changes, and then how we would apply those different types of changes. So I take this version 1.2 right here, and the first thing I can do is I'll just go to the 1.5 that I had, and I'll make an update to that one. So version 1.5, if we look at the properties of 1.5, we can see that it stores all the information of the things, like what types of things you have to pass through and everything like that. What I'm going to do is just make a straight copy of that version. I'm ready to update this one to the next version. So we'll see that it's going to say customer demographic service copy of 1.5 when this copy gets completed. So I'll take that copy, and this is the copy that I'm going to make my changes to. So I found that 1.5 actually assigned too much memory to a system, so I'm going to pull some of that back, and I want to change the version of the application that I'm using. So I'll open up the designer, the easiest way to make changes inside of this service here. And the first thing I can see is that release number is copy of 1.5. I'm going to change it to 1.9. I made some changes, but I'm not ready to call it a whole version update for this application. If we look at the tiers here, I'll bring it up to 75%. We see we have multiple tiers. We have some app tiers, and we also have this web tier. Well, I found that the web tier has too much RAM assigned to it, so I'm going to drop some of that down because it's really just wasting that RAM. It's not really using it at all. So if I go under properties of that service, of that tier, that VM template for that tier, we look at the hardware configuration, we can see that I'm running at basically 1.5 as the start for my dynamic memory, and it can bump up to whatever amount of RAM it needs. So come on, pop up here real quick. All right, let's close that out, and we're going to hop back into VMM real quick here. All right, so connecting back into the system, we're going to log in as administrator. All right, let's go to this other demo machine I have. All right, so inside of VMM here, again, I have this customer demographics application, version 1.2. If we look at the library, here I have this customer demographics service 1.2. I haven't done an upgrade on this service in this environment, but I'll do that right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this service template. And copying the service template, I'll make all my changes to that copy. We leave the original available because the original has services deployed against it. So I take this copy and I'll open Designer. And at this point, let's make the changes that we wanted to make to this service. I have the customer demographics web. Well, first thing I want to do is change the version number. So update this one from 1.2. Let's just call it 1.3. And the next thing I'm going to do is edit the amount of RAM assigned to this machine. So if I look at the properties of this virtual machine template, I have the hardware configuration, and it's set at 1 virtual processor and 512 megs of memory. Well, I found that 1 virtual processor is not enough. I'm going to pop it up to 2, but I want to change the amount of RAM from 512. I want to give it 1024. So it's going to start at 1 gig of RAM, and because it can use dynamic memory, I'll let it bump up to 2 gigs if it needs to. So those are the two major changes I wanted to make here. In this VM on the service template, the other change I want to make is I want to change the application version number. One of the applications that I have, this order processing application, which is, let me make this a little bit bigger so we can all see it. This order processing VM tier right here, if I look at the properties there, I can see under the application configuration that we're using a server app package, and we're using this server app package called CD order processor. Well, I know that we have an update to that application package, so let me pull this over, and we see that there's the CD order processor service, but I also have this new order processor for this ST5 app, and that one actually is the same app that I can use here, so I want to pick that as the replacement or update to that application. So I'll hit OK there. I'll call this VST502 just to make sure I understand the changes that I've made here, and I'll hit OK. So I've made two changes to this service template. I've changed the amount of RAM assigned to a particular VM and the service running on the VM. And I've also changed the version of the OS that the version of the application that I'm running on the order processing tier. One of the things that we have inside this application is that the web tier has 2 instances that are going to be deployed initially. It could scale up to 5, but I have 2 upgrade domains, meaning that I'm going to take however many VMs are deployed for that tier, divide it by 2, and just bring that many down at a time. If I had 7, then it would be 3 down one time, 4 down the other, that type of thing. After I've finished all those changes that I've made, I'm going to do a save and validate. It's going to check, make sure I haven't made any stupid mistakes, and get this thing up and ready to go. So at this point in time now, I'll see I have now 2 lists of these services. So I have both the version 1.2 and also the version 1.3. But the VM service itself doesn't see this update yet because I haven't published it. So I'm ready now to publish that service update. So I'll hit publish here, and at this point in time, it's based off of the 1.2 version, and it's published and available to be used. If I now look at my VMs and services, I can see the different tiers that I have, and I can see on my web tier, I have 2 VMs deployed. I can see 1 tier for the business logic, SQL, and order processing. And I'm running version 1.2. Well, the first thing I want to do now is on the service, I want to check to see if there are any updates. So if I do a refresh of the service, we can see under update status that we have a new release available. So there is a new release available, and if I want to, I can apply that release to this machine. So is there a question?
Well, there's just been a few kind of questions. People are really excited about this service template model, but it sounds like there's a little bit of unfamiliarity with wanting to adopt it. Do we have any plans to, include like sample service templates? Specifically, there's been requests about sample service templates for a cluster.
So there are some sample service templates that we've made available, not as a template, but really as blog articles on how to create these types of things. We're also looking to, now that System Center 2012 is finally coming out, really do a lot of education on how the service model is different than maybe developing applications initially, and what types of things you can do and you can't do. So you'll see a lot more information over the next 6 months about things within the service template. Talking to some of our TAP customers and MVPs that have started working on this with their customers and their companies, what they found is that the service template model is a little different. Well, it's different than how they would do things in the past. And it's not that they can't do it, but a lot of the developers that they work with are used to doing things one way, and this is a very different way of doing these things. So they're looking at doing 2 things right now. The first one is getting their infrastructure ready to go and be able to present and do the private cloud, but also they're doing a large-scale education to their development groups, showing them how they can do things a little bit differently in their side, which makes things a lot easier as far as running and operationalizing these applications that their developers are running. And what they've said is that it's a parallel activity, and it's going to take a little time to start moving these developers over to that. Just like it took a long time to move people from touching and feeling a physical machine to moving to virtual. So it's not something that you're going to change the way you do it overnight, but over time you'll see a lot of different applications and services start being developed for cloud principles, which is really going to handle this service model. So yeah, there are some blogs now, and there will be blogs with more detail on how to set up these service templates. Creating a service template isn't a, two-click thing. It takes a little while to set up. What you're going to see, though, is that if you start developing your applications with service templates in mind, if you take the time to set up these service templates for these applications you deploy over and over and over again, it's going to make up for a lot of that wasted time that you do afterwards and just configuring these applications. Is going to take all that stuff for you. We talked to some customers, and every time they installed an application, they had a 146-page runbook they had to go through, click by click by click, on every piece of configuration that they had to do. If you're able to take that 146-page run group, put it into a server app v package, and be able to deploy this application multiple times without having to go through all these different configuration steps, it's going to save you a lot of time in the future. So that's where the education between what you're doing now and what you can be doing in the future is going to take some time, but it's going to really pay off in the future.
Great, thanks.
So I have this update, and these are some of the things that, when you set up, you can show your developers that, hey, now that I have made these changes that I want to make, instead of having to go to every single deployed service and every single VM in that service and make all these different changes, I can make it to the one template and then push it out to all these different deployed services that are out there. So I have this version that's a new release available. At that point, I can specify for that particular template, set the template to the version that I want. So what I want to do here is, instead of just modifying existing application settings, I want to update to the newer version of the template. So I can pick the version that I want, which is version 1.3 here. And at that point, just go through the rest of these this wizard. What it's going to do is say, okay, here's the current value of the settings that you have. Do we have to change them? No. Do you want to change them? If you wanted to change any of these values, you could. And it would push those values into the service, but you don't have to. The next thing is, how do you want to do these updates? Do you want to do them in place, or do you want to do them image-based and deploy new virtual machines? Well, all the changes I made are in this template update are things that I can do in place. I don't have to replace the VHD. So I'm just going to do in-place updates for them. It's going to go through and check all the existing values of the service, any new values, is there anything I need to add inside of there. It's going to look at each of the different tiers and sees what's going to happen. And you're going to see something in that viewing of the tiers. We have a couple of warnings here. The warnings are for the different tiers that don't have upgrade domains. So I have multiple tiers. I have a demographics tier. No changes are going to be made to it, so I can ignore that warning. The web tier, there are no warnings because I have upgrade domains, so it's not going to bring the whole thing down. This is basically just telling me that order processing tier, I'm going to have to take the whole tier down because I don't have multiple upgrade domains. And that's fine. I understand that that's going to happen in the upgrade process, so I'm okay with that. And if I had cared about the SQL Server, but since I'm not making any changes there, it's not going to affect it. Then the next thing is, okay, I've done that. Now I want to apply those updates immediately. So as soon as I hit OK here, why don't we just start that update process on the tier? So I do that and hit finish, and at this point it's going to start the job. And that job's going to run through all the different steps. The first thing we see is that it's stopping that web tier. And if we look at that web tier, we see the VM is set for 512 megs right now. I'm stopping the VM. It's going to make that adjusted setting from 512 megs to 1 gig, and we see here now that's at 1 gig. And it's going to restart the VM, because that's all it really had to do is change that, change the number of processors. If I look at Web 1 here, it's still 1 processor, 512, but Web 2 here is 2 processors and 1 gig. And after it gets that machine up and running, that machine's checked back in, and we see that everything's running okay on that machine, we will then do that same process with this Web 1 server here. So we see it's now stopping, shutting that VM down, going to make those changes that we made, and then it's going to bring that machine back up. So those are some of the things you can do, and I can push this out to all the different virtual machine or services that have deployed through this customer demographics service template. After it brings both of those things down, the next thing it's going to do is work on the order processing tier. And here, the VM is going to continue to run, but what it's going to do is it's going to take this deployed service and it's going to update that with the updated version that I applied to this. So it's not going to use the existing version, but it's going to save the state, deploy that update, and then reapply the state to it. And it's just running through the demo from that, or just running through the rest of the updates for that system. So that shows you some of the benefits that you can have within the modifying and managing your service templates, and being able to do these image-based and these in-place updates allows you to make the change in one place and then push it out to all these different places.
So I have a good question about, these service templates, running them simultaneously in production and in a test environment. So let's say I've got this template in the test environment, I love it. What's the easiest way to make that live, to go and port it from my test world over to my production world?
So I've made the service template. If the VMM server is managing both of those environments, both the dev and the production environment, then I can simply make that template available to my production cloud, and people can start deploying it once it's gold. The other thing I can do is this. If I have two different VMM servers, one VMM server is in my dev environment and another one's in my production environment, I can take that template, and let's say this 1.3 version of the template, and I can export it. And when I export that template, it exports all the information. And I have a couple of options here. Do I just want to export the metadata of that template, or do I want to export all the different files and everything that are necessary for that template? So I pick the template that I want to export, and I specify where I want to export that template to, and I can copy it to a local machine, or I can copy it up to a network or something like that. And actually, let's create a new folder inside of here, call it template, and then hit OK there. And at that point, it's going to export all the information for that template to that machine. If I wanted to add other templates in when I do this export process, I can add those templates straight from this machine. If I want to override existing or extract any of the sensitive data and keep that data inside the template so it's all encrypted and everything like that, I can turn those things on as well. I can even set a password value against it so that when I move it from one side and I import it into the other side, I have to type in that password to protect it. So I won't have any of that information set up. I'll hit OK, and it'll start exporting that template. Then once that template is exported, I can import it. And now at the new VMM server, the import process, I may not have the same VHD file or the same network names. Here I have Contoso, maybe over there I have Contoso prod as the name. Well, we have this equivalency set up, so when I import that template, I can choose, I want it to be this VHD file, not this other one. I want it to use this network instead of the other one. So I have the ability to set those things as well.
Okay, another question around these upgrades. Well, first of all, we've been asked, can you exactly define what is an upgrade domain?
So an upgrade domain is a number that you specify that says, when I upgrade this service, I'm going to bring down the number of VMs that are deployed in that service divided by the upgrade domain. So if I had the upgrade domain set at 3, then I would take the number of VMs that are in that service, and I would divide it in that tier of that service and divide it by 3, and I would bring down a third of them the first time, a third the second, a third the last time. But if there were like 7 and it was 3, then I would bring down 3 the first time, 2 the second time, 2 the third time, because it may not evenly divide. So an upgrade domain just means that every time I do an upgrade of that tier, I only upgrade a specific piece at a time until I've upgraded the entire tier. So I'll bring down a third, do the upgrade on those, bring those back up, bring down the next third, do the upgrade on those, bring them back up, then do the next third, bring them back up. Now, if the application can support having multiple versions of it at the same time, maybe I have the first set of VMs and they're connected to a web interface and I'm updating the whole scale web page. Well, the users that are connected to the websites with the old version would still see the old version until those machines got updated. So your application has to be able to handle, or you have to be okay with it, that you have two versions up at the same time. If I don't have that, then I'll probably just want to keep one upgrade domain, bring them all down, bring them back up. Depends on how much outage I want.
Okay. A few other questions on the topic. Can we upgrade service templates while they're offline?
So a service that is shut down, I don't know, I haven't tried. So we probably could apply that because it depends on what the update is. If the update is something where the VM has to be running, like I'm updating something inside the VM, then no, we couldn't. But if it was something where it's just changing the configuration of the VM, like the amount of RAM, I think that might work. I haven't tried it.
Okay, and now what would be the process of updating a VHD itself? Meaning, I have VHD old, I have VHD new. I need to go and replace the existing VHD with a new VHD. Is there anything unique to that process? So
what I would do is this. To update a gold VHD that I have, I would take a VM and deploy it off of that VHD file. I would make all the changes that I want inside that VHD file, and then I would create a template off of that VM. And that would give me that updated VHD file. That VHD file I would then store in the library. And so underneath the library, if I look at like my different library servers, and I look at this VMMO1 library server, it has a bunch of things like VHDs, and I have these multiple VHDs that are created, and I would just create a new VHD off of that. One of the things that you can do with VHDs are you can set properties of them. So I may have a virtual hard disk file, and I might want to say that this file is a specific type of family, so I may want to give it a family name like this is server OS, no apps, and a release number, and I can call this 1.0. And when I make that update to the VHD file, and I store that updated VHD file inside this library, I can set an equivalent resource so that all those things are, so that this is seen as an update to that existing VHD file. So I can put those things together. The other thing is when I import this service template and it says it needs this kind of VHD, I can pick whatever one I have in my library at that other VMM server.
Great. And could you remind us one more time, what authoring tool are you using to actually create and manipulate these service templates? So
I'm modifying and creating the service templates through the service template designer that's within VMM itself. So VMM comes with that authoring tool to do that.
Excellent. That's all the questions we have on service templates for now.
Great. So if we go back now and look at the VMs and services, we see that we're now up to version 1.3. It completed. There's a job status here, so I could look at the job itself and find out, what worked, what didn't, if something failed. All that stuff's kept for me. And if something failed, I could make some changes and restart the job, and it would pick off from where it left off. All right. So we've talked now about service templates, and service templates is going to be something that it's just going to take a while for people to really understand, but once you start using them, you'll see the power that service template gives you. But now we want to know, with all these services that are deployed, I want to ensure that the cloud that I'm providing is giving me the right size. I'm not going to want to have a lot of spare resources sitting around. I'd like to just almost do just in time on my resources. Make sure I have a little bit of a buffer, but I don't want to buy for my peak usage when I'm only using 10% of that most of the time. I'll buy for what I need to use and then be able to expand. And to do that, I'll need to know, what is the utilization of my private cloud right now? So what's happening on my system right now? I'll also want to trend that over time and say, over the last 6 months, how have I been growing on this private cloud? Because maybe the usage over the last 6 months will help me forecast my future private cloud needs. So with VMM and Operations Manager, we have built-in reporting on how your infrastructure is running. And what happens is this, so we have the ability within Operations Manager to do private cloud usage reporting, where we'll choose, what's the date range that we want to look at, what is the host that we want to view, and one of the things you'll see is that it can be not only just Hyper-V hosts, but all your different hosts that are on there, and then we'll generate a report on how these machines are performing, and you'll be able to use that information to say, how has things been working over time. The other thing we'll be able to do is some what-if forecasting. So we'll be able to, if you have SQL analysis services running inside of your on your Operations Manager reporting server, you'll be able to actually do some SQL analysis what-if forecasting and say, we've trended data over the past X amount of months for this amount of usage. This is what the change or the update is going to be anticipated over the next month or two, and you'll be able to decide, do I need to buy more capacity or not from that. So let's show a little bit about what that looks like and how we get those reporting information. So I'll move back to this system right here, and we have under Operations Manager, we have this reporting section. And under reporting, we have all the reports for System Center Virtual Machine Manager. So we've created these different reports and put them in there, and they could be things like, what's my capacity utilization, what's the host utilization. Some of these are pretty interesting. So if we look at the host utilization report and we go through it, this is where we can find out how each of my hosts are performing. And we can do this over a set period of time, day, week, month, year. So I'll do it from the beginning of the month to today. If I add a group, then what I can do is pick inside the group and choose the different Hyper-V hosts that I have inside of here. It's pulling all this information, but what if I search by class and I pick Hyper-V host? I can pick all of the different Hyper-V hosts in my environment, and I will pick these 3 hosts right here. I can also add my ESX hosts, and they are called con prod ESX. So if I add my Hyper-V hosts, I can add them in as well as my ESX or any other type of hosts inside of here. So let me pull them up right here. I'll just do the Hyper-V ones. I can't find them real quick here. And I will hit OK. And at this point, let me just hit Add Object here. And we see the Comprod ESX hosts right here. So I'll choose some of those as well and hit OK. So now we have 5 hosts that we're looking at. We're looking at some Hyper-V hosts and some ESX hosts. And we hit Run, and it'll generate the report on these different hosts. And I can see how the performance is running for these different systems. The other thing that we'll be able to do, and the one I want to show after this, is capacity. And the capacity planning would help me determine, it kind of pulls multiple different resources together and gives me kind of a performance index number on how these things are performing. So while that's running, I'll start the other one up here, and that's capacity utilization. Again, we'll just do it for this month. We'll add object. And here we'll add the Hyper-V hosts and, again, the couple of ESX server hosts. So we have those hosts available. Let's see, did this thing come up? Okay, so first of all, this report came up, and it shows me, I'm probably not using a lot of the resources on here. I have a lot of VMs, using a lot of RAM on these systems, but I'm not really fully utilizing things like the CPU, so I can see how things are running within this environment. If I look at the capacity utilization within this same group, when it runs this report, it's going to kind of aggregate all these values of CPU, disk, network, and memory, pull them all together, and really just tell me how these things are performing. So things that we can see here is that the different hosts, we can see that most of my hosts aren't using a lot of resources if we look at the performance impact factor. So I'm not running out of resources on these hosts. They can really handle a lot more, especially in the CPU realm. Under net transfer, I can see the network piece of it. I can see the utilization of these devices, and what we see is that most of my utilization is through memory. I have a lot of different systems that are running. Each of those systems require some memory, so it's really pulling a lot of my memory. But my disk I/O, my network I/O, my CPU is all running just fine. And if any of these information I want to look at what the values are, I can just pull down that piece in the report, and I can see over the period of time, this is the aggregated amount of CPU, disk, and network memory usage over the past month. So I have all that capability available for me to be used. So reporting gives me that capability of understanding how things are running here. And the next thing that I would want to do is look at, if I had analysis services running, I could look at the host utilization growth and predict what that growth is going to be. I can also report on the individual virtual machines as well, things like virtual machine utilization. And here, again, we'll do it for this month. We'll add an object, and we will add objects that contain O1. So I have all these virtual machines that have been deployed. Some are infrastructure servers, some are just service VMs, everything. I'll just add all those servers in there, hit OK, and we'll run that report, and we'll get a good information about how are these virtual machines performing, what's their CPU utilization. I see that my operations manager server is running pretty hot compared to some of these other servers here. I can sort by lowest to highest, and if we pull down here, we see that my operations manager server is the hottest machine that I have on here. Some of the other ones are running not so hot. If we look at the RAM utilization or memory, we can see which ones are needing or wanting more RAM than they're really using. So I have all this different information that I can use to see how these virtual machines are performing and how everything's working together. So with that, we've talked a lot now about the different environments. We talked about dynamic optimization, service access, service templates, and now performance and monitoring. But were there some questions that are out there?
You were. Why don't we wrap this up, and then we'll spend a few minutes covering a few remaining questions.
Excellent. So at this point, we've talked about, over the few sessions that we've shared together, we've talked about building that private cloud, managing the infrastructure components, and in this last session about how to monitor and operate the private cloud infrastructure itself to really give you the foundation for the private cloud. What the things that we've done in these sessions that we've talked about here are really giving you that foundation for then gaining all the benefits of the Microsoft private cloud through the service delivery automation and the application performance management, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So the things that we've really focused on today are optimizing this private cloud to handle our dynamic workloads, controlling access, who has access to those resources, a better and updated approach to how we handle updates to these services and apps that are deployed, and how to keep on top of knowing how much resources are being used and trending that for the future.
Excellent. Thanks, Kenan.
Sure thing.
Well, let's jump into some of the questions that we have. We'll answer questions for about 5 minutes, then we'll take a break. First question we have ties back to the templates again. The question is around, is there any way to compare templates, or is using the versioning the best way to figure out if there's a change that has been applied to an existing one?
There's no way to say what's the difference between this template and this template. The versioning would help you do that, and that would be something you probably want to keep track of in, say, your CMDB or something like that. And with the Service Manager connector to VMM, it'll pull that information as you make changes and updates to the templates into the CMDB.
Great. So hopefully you're aware when a change does happen.
Right.
Great. Well, next question is going back to some of the earlier topics as well. So first of all, with cluster creation, can we create Xen clusters and VMware clusters, or do we manage
don't
them?
create them. We just use them. So you
that
create
goes back
them
to the same
outside of-
concept you were talking about earlier, right? Where we're just managing their VMs. We're not necessarily managing the hosts themselves.
Exactly, exactly.
Great. Now, will power optimization also work on VMware and Xen servers?
Power optimization is Hyper-V only.
Okay, so specifically targeted for that. Right. Now, when we actually go through scheduling this power optimization, and we have servers that are distributed, meaning different time zones, do we have a logic that takes that into account, or do you know how that works? Is it based on the primary site where you configure it?
You know, I'm not sure.
That's a tricky one, huh?
So I haven't played around with that. That would be something we'd have to look into. But I would imagine that it's based on the time zone of the VMM server, not the time zone of the different hosts. But I'm not sure on that.
Great. Well, that would be a great question to post in the TechNet forum. There are TechNet forums already available for all of the System Center 2012 products, so please post that there. We'll get some more information on that soon. Now, as we actually go through a dynamic optimization process, is it possible for us to leave out a particular host inside the cluster, or is the boundary of dynamic optimization that entire cluster?
The boundary of dynamic optimization is the entire cluster. Now, you can use some things with custom placement rules that that specify where you want to move things around to and such, but at the base level, dynamic optimization is in the entire cluster.
So one example of how you could do that, the failover cluster itself does have properties called preferred owners and possible owners. So you could actually specify this group of node is the preferred or the possible owners for these set of VMs. This group of node, prefer or possible owners for this set of VMs. And dynamic optimization will still honor that underlying cluster logic. And ideally, it will separate them. But still, the primary goal is to keep the services up and running and to load balance, so it's not going to take any service down either.
Exactly, and a couple other things. We do have inside of VMM itself custom placement rules also, where you can say, in this VM needs to be on a host with this type of property, and as long as you've set that property on the host, then it'll be able to move it between one of those VMs, but it won't. And you can say a must contain or a may contain as well.
Excellent. Well, now we have a question about the actual host itself. Why should we use Server Core instead of a full edition of Windows Server for our actual host?
There are a couple reasons to use Server Core over a full version of Windows. And there are a couple reasons to use the full version of Windows over Server Core. It really depends on what you as an organization want to do. But with Server Core, we found that there is about a 50% less amount of patching on that system because of all the extra stuff that...
There's no Internet Explorer, for example.
Exactly. But some people think that Server Core is too limiting, and so they've made some updates to Windows 8, or the Windows Server 8, which will have something more about that. And you know, if you look at the build sessions, you can get more of that information.
Yeah, there's a lot more flexibility with how you can upgrade and downgrade between Server Core and a full installation.
Right.
You know, just to emphasize on your point about there's fewer components there. Fewer components, of course, means there's fewer things to patch. Fewer patches means fewer reboots, higher availability. So if you're really concerned about uptime with regards to patching, go and use Server Core, install that. You're going to have less failovers, less needs to patch those hosts. Now, our final question that we have, this was actually asked yesterday, and I believe Sean addressed it, but we'd love to get your perspective on this.
Okay.
What are your thoughts around using System Center 2012 as far as multiple tenancy? Meaning, you know, what's the best way to really, you know, isolate individual owners, isolate individual roles for, let's say, a host or environment?
So there are things you can do with System Center 2012 for multi-tenancy, but it's not totally there yet. The fact is, like, if I'm doing service deployment, I need to have access to the domain so that I can communicate with that. VMM can communicate with that VM that was deployed. Makes it really difficult when I have multiple different domains from multiple different companies. And so some of those things aren't going to be possible yet with the existing version of System Center 2012. There are some things you can do where if you're just managing the underlying hosts and the VMs are just regular VMs you would deploy, then you can handle some of that multi-tenancy. You would have to give users access to your VM environments. They would have to have some type of domain or access to your domain somehow if you wanted them to see their cloud or something like that. So we're working on making that better, but the story right now is it does multi-tenancy okay, but really there's a lot more that hosters would want.
Okay, great. And there's one final question that came up around placement policies that I'm going to address. The question is around how can you go and actually separate VMs with a similar role to put them on different hosts. So an example of when you might want to use this is if you have a guest cluster, a virtualized cluster. You don't want that running on a single host because if that host crashes, you lose the whole cluster. Likewise, if you have infrastructure servers, let's say you have your DHCP servers, you don't want all of those VMs on a single host. If that host crashes, you lose everything. So one of the ways that you can actually isolate and separate the VMs across different hosts is a cluster property called anti-affinity class names. Basically, using this property, you go and say, this VM is blue, this VM is blue, and any two VMs that share the same anti-affinity class name are purposely going to try to separate themselves across different hosts. There's actually a great blog on the Cluster Team blog written in December 2010 about VM placement policies that talks about preferred owners, possible owners, anti-affinity class names. So if you want more details, go to blogs.msdn.com/clustering and find the link from December 10th, and I will post that as well shortly. Well, Kenneth, that about wraps up this session. Thank you so much for joining us for these 4 modules. I hope everybody's really learned a lot about not only how to go and deploy this private cloud infrastructure and optimizing it, but then monitoring, managing it, and supporting it.
Exactly.
So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the time today.
And we'll be back after a break with Sean Christensen, and we're going to go and talk about service delivery and automation, how to monitor, and how to operate it. Thank you.
Thank you.